Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Our current session is about some definitions of speech communities. I hope and expect by the end of this session you would be able to understand certain definitions of speech communities, and you would also have an idea how different dimensions and perspectives are presented and treated in these definitions. To start with, I am presenting a definition that is given by Bloomfield. According to Bloomfield, a speech community is a group of people who interact by means of speech. If you focus on the screen, you can see the use of word group. This is a very important part of this definition of speech communities. And actually, this word that is chosen here, group, it gives it a very simple definition to understand. Moving on, if you look at another definition that is by Gompers, it's quite a long definition that I would read for you. Any human aggregate characterized by regular and frequent interaction by means of a shared body of verbal signs and set off from similar aggregates by significant differences in language use. Now, what you need to understand in this definition is any human aggregate, any collection of human beings that are characterized by what? Some kind of interaction of a shared body of verbal signs. So, verbal signs is something significant that is pointed out here. And how it is identified? It is identified relatively by comparing and contrasting with any other human aggregate where there is another set of verbal symbols that is used and which is different from this set. So, to exist as a speech community, it has to have the characteristic of being different from another such community. To distinguish it from the other community, what is needed is a different set of, verbal signs. With this, we move on to a definition that is given by LaBeouf, and as you can see, it is from 1972, so, it is in a sense quite old, but it marks certain things. Let's see what is that. And LaBeouf says it is not defined. So, a way of defining speech community that is taken here is by pointing out what it is not. So, it is not defined by any marked agreement in the use of language elements, so much as by participation in a set of shared norms. If you compare this definition to the previous definition of Gompers, what you would notice is their focus was, in that definition, the focus was on the verbal signs. Here, what is the focus? Shared norms. Because the choice of verbal signs, in other words, the choice of language, is determined by what? The norms, the beliefs, the value system. So, shared norms, according to LaBeouf, make a community. These norms may be observed in overt type of evaluative behavior and by the uniformity of abstract patterns of variation which are invariant in respect to particular levels of language use. And again, observing these values and norms related to language would be differentiated from another set by finding out how they deviate from them or how they differ from them. So, what is the essential criterion? Some significant dimension of experience has to be shared. There has to be something in the speech community, what is shared by, what is owned by, or possessed by all the members of that community. And secondly, it is to be related to ways in which members of that group use, value, or interpret language. Secondly, what it means is that their language behavior, their language attitude has to be the same. How do they look at language? How do they give it value or importance or significance? And how do they interpret it? This all should have to be a shared experience by the members of a speech community. Apparently, it seems so far that the problem of defining a speech community is resolved. However, there are certain problems. And here I'm going to point out a problem that is mentioned by Patrick. The kind of group that sociolinguists have generally attempted to study is called speech community. Now, this is a kind of oversimplified definition. A kind of group that sociolinguists would study is called a speech community. There are a lot of problems with it. This is too loosely constructed, very generalized. And Leon offers a definition that may be an answer to this problem, which says a real speech community is all the people who use a language or dialect. Now, in answering that, actually this again raises a question. People who use same language or people who use same dialect may make a community, speech community, according to Leon's. But again, it is not possible in so many situations. People living at place X may not identify themselves with the language of area X. And they may identify themselves with another language that is spoken at place Y or at place Z. This, however, resolves one issue, and that is when we think of two terms, language and speech community, they are two completely different ideas. Language is not synonym, or it is not, coterminous, I would say, with what we call speech community. For example, English is spoken at a lot of places in the world. So the whole world, wherever, for example, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, in Pakistan, in India, and in the UK and the USA, everywhere where English is spoken, we cannot call them one speech community. Because the values, the beliefs, and the kind of attitude and reactions to language, they vary in each of these areas. And not only so, but also, because of these beliefs and values and reactions to language that are different, the impact is that the varieties that are spoken, the shape and the form that language has taken in all these areas is completely different. And as I've said earlier, in South Africa, in New Zealand, and for example, in the expatriates in China, if you look at the varieties of English that are used, they are completely different. So we need to ask ourselves, in the sense of a modern lingua franca, does English make a community of speakers, or it does not? Because what we need to notice also is that there are a lot of countries where English is used, whereas there are other languages which are used with it. For example, when we look at the cases of Switzerland, Canada, many African states, New York City, for example, or for Pakistan, or in the case of any of the cities of Pakistan, multilingualism exists, where English as well as other languages are spoken. So would English make these a part of the bigger, broader community of speakers of English or not, is a huge debate. Furthermore, if speech communities are defined solely by their linguistic characteristics, what would happen? We would just be talking circularly again and again about the same characteristics, because then it would be isolated, and the social aspects that surround it from all the sides, they would be kept separate. Using linguistic characteristics alone to determine what is or what not is a speech community is a very, very problematic idea, and it is nearly impossible to resolve it. Why? Because speech is surrounded by social factors. And because in every area there are certain characteristics of language, A, B, C, and so on, where a particular member of a speech community X, for example, may relate to or may not relate to. Surely speakers do use linguistic characteristics to achieve group identity, and group differentiation from each other, but they use other characteristics as well. They differentiate themselves in terms of age, gender, social class, education, ethnicity, etc. So overall, the idea of speech communities is quite troublesome, and it is difficult to give one definition for that.